Hello, welcome to Introduction to Visual Basic for Applications. To get started, we're going to briefly go over what is Visual Basic. If you're here, then you probably already know that Visual Basic is a programming language. It's an easy-to-learn language relative to something like C++ or Fortran. More specifically, we'll be discussing Visual Basic for Applications. You can think of this as a subset of Visual Basic. Looking at the programs that we have listed here, we see that they possess certain attributes which are unique to them. Within AutoCAD are elements such as drawings, projects, and snap settings. Excel has elements such as workbooks, worksheets, and cells. Access has elements such as tables, queries, forms, and reports. These unique aspects are cataloged in dynamically linked libraries, or DLLs as they're commonly referred to. For instance, Excel has a DLL specific to it which refers to its functions and attributes such as rows and columns. Access likewise has its own DLLs that refer to records and the fields within those records. By cataloging these program-specific attributes in DLLs, we avoid sorting through a lot of extraneous code when developing. There will be no references to AutoCAD drawings in Access, or references to queries whenever we're working in Word. In the end, Visual Basic for Application refers to the DLLs in these programs to allow users to develop custom functions and automate processes. Alright, so here's an example of some code, some generic old code, and here's an example of the result of that code. So here's the code, here's the result, just a little message box. So to get started, we're going to be using Microsoft's Excel 2010. You can use 2003. There will be some differences, and you can also use 2007. There shouldn't be too many differences. So what we want to do is, to get started, just to kind of introduce us to Visual Basic coding, is we want to go ahead and open up our workbook. We want to go to the View tab, and we want to go to Macros, and we want to select a macro, and we want to go ahead and record that. So we're going to record our macro, and in the name, you want to go ahead and put your last name, and then go ahead and take your time and just put in some random things, like whatever you want to type in there. And then whenever you're done, go back to the View tab, go back to Macros, and tell it to stop recording. Once you're done with that, you want to press Alt F11, and then it's going to bring up the Visual Basic Editor. And you're going to go over here to the project window, and you want to go down to Modules, and you want to double click that right here, and it's going to bring up your code. Again, because this is Visual Basic for Applications, and in this case we're dealing with Excel, the code you're going to see for this macro is specific to Microsoft's Excel. So let's go ahead and see an example of this. Okay, so to get started, we're going to want to open up a new workbook, and we want to actually go up here to the ribbon. We want to go to the View tab, and we are going to go over to where it says Macros, and we want to start recording a new macro. Now, the first thing it's going to ask you is for a name for your macro. You can put anything you want. You might actually want to just put like your last name or something you're going to recognize, because you will see it again later. No spaces or no funny characters. Just keep it simple. So I'm just going to go ahead and we're going to say DoubleCheck. There we go. Now, the next thing you can do is go ahead and just start typing some things in. So Scuttles was here. I might go 1. Put some numbers in. Maybe I want to add those numbers together. There we go. Perhaps I want to put some letters in. There we go. And once you're done, you want to go back over to View, back over to Macros, and you want to go ahead and tell it to stop recording. Now it's done recording. Okay, so we've recorded our macro. So now what we want to do is we want to press Alt F11, and that is going to bring up our Visual Basic Editor. What I want you to notice is we're going to go over here to our project window. We're going to go to the Modules folder, and we're going to click on this icon that says Module 1. Here we go. Now if you notice, whatever name you put for your macro, your last name, that should be your procedure name. Down here is all of our code. And what I want to mention here is that all the code that's here, it's legitimate code, but it's Excel specific. So we're not going to have ranges in Word or AutoCAD or anywhere else like that, or references to cells. So this is all of our code, and we're going to go into a little more detail, but here's what I want to show you. Up here we have a play button, a pause button, and a reset button or a stop button. And over here, if we want to get back to our spreadsheet, we can either press Alt F11 again, or we can just click on this little icon right here that looks like our application. So we're going to go ahead and click on that, and that brings us back to Excel. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to delete our data. Then we're going to bring our Visual Basic Editor up again by hitting Alt F11. And this time what I want to show you is that if you press F8, it's actually going to step through the code. So if I go ahead and I press F8, notice it starts here, it's highlighted, and as I go, it's actually going to activate the code line by line every time I press F8. So pay attention to what's going on in both the Visual Basic Editor and our Excel workbook. So as I go down the line, it activates each line of code. Now even from here, you can have a little fun with this. If you want to, we know what this line of code does. It puts the sentence into the active cell. So we're going to go ahead and just play around with that. And we'll say, we'll just put DoubleCheck Productions. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to run the same thing again. And this time it's going to add an additional line. There we go. Same thing as before. And then there we go. Now, obviously you don't have to press F8 to go line by line. If you want to, what you can do is you can just hit the play button. It'll actually go through the whole thing. All right, so that's just a very, very basic, at-a-glance introduction to Visual Basic for Applications code. This is how it looks from a macro, and this is the Visual Basic Editor. We're going to go into a little more detail now. So here we have an overview of the project and its various components. So the overall thing that we have is we're going to have a project. That's going to be where all of your forms, your modules, your coding, your objects, that's where everything that you're trying to accomplish, that's where it's going to take place. It's a project. Your module is a component of a project. You can have multiple modules. It's within the modules is where we do all of our coding. That's where your procedures are going to be, such as like macros, sub-procedures, and functions. Within each module is going to be a procedure or multiple procedures. This is going to be your coding that's going to allow you to perform specific tasks or return specific values in the case of a function. And then you actually have your code. And this is your instructions that you're going to give to the computer that you can read, that the computer understands, and then whenever it's compiled, it's going to execute those instructions. And that's where we get the term executable, because we're executing instructions. Okay, so here we have some terms. We have procedure, that's going to be your code. And there's types of procedures. There's a sub-procedure, which typically performs a task like opening, closing, or moving things around. A function is a term reserved for something that returns a value. You have input, like an argument input, and it returns a value. An expression is what we typically think of whenever it comes to math, like y equals x plus 2. That's referred to as an expression. A constant is a value that remains the same, it never changes. Pi is a good example of that. And a variable is a value that can change even within our code. Again, just like math. Finally, we have an argument. In an argument, it can be a constant, it can be a variable. Normally, that's reserved for our input, a value that we're inputting. When naming a procedure, there are some rules. So first off, it has to start with a letter. It can only include letters, numbers, and underscores. It can only be 255 characters. Fortunately, it is not case sensitive, and there can't be any spaces or symbols, and the procedure name must be unique. It's a good rule of thumb to keep your procedure name unique within a project. So for example, here we're going to go ahead and put in a name that's permitted. We're going to press enter. And if you notice, whenever you do this in the editor, the end sub will pop up and these sub and end sub letters will turn, or the letters in there will turn blue. If you notice, this is where your code goes between sub and end sub. Or your function and end function, and this is just showing that the underscores are permitted.